So hi, my name is Steve Hayes, and I'd like to welcome you to this discussion with Frans de Waal, who's here at the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science Conference, and just gave a wonderful invited address there.
Mm-hmm.
Frans is the C.H. Chandler professor in the Department of Psychology at Emory University, and is, I think, one of the best known, most widely recognized researchers in animal behavior in the world. And part of what you're really known for, I think, is something that has happened as a sort of change in the field of a vast area of pro-social or cooperative kind of processes
Mm-hmm.
in non-human animals that was just not really taken very seriously for many years.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that was?
Well, in the 70s and 80s, they were very focused in biology on, let's say, self-interest and selfishness and competition. We had the selfish gene kind of books. We had all sorts of books about winning is good, losing is bad. Basically, competition is what drives the evolutionary process and also what drives society. This is also the time of Reagan and Thatcher, by the way. So a very interesting time, yes, socio-economically. And there was no room for anything else. And so in that time, I discovered as a student that chimpanzees reconcile after fights. They kiss and embrace after fights. And they didn't really know what to do with that. They were not necessarily opposed to the idea, but it didn't fit in their thinking at all. And so they poo-pooed it as not important. It could not be important. Now we think it's actually extremely important, yeah, that they manage to keep their society together despite the conflict that occurs. But at the time, winning and losing was all that mattered, really.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if some of that is the level of analysis, because when you look at the whole organism and its context in history and think about it from a biological point of view, behavioral biology, that way, versus we're part of the life cycle of genes, that idea. You mentioned Dawkins, and it had a huge impact on many of us.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this kind of disturbing thing, two things. One is ascribing selfishness to
genes,
to genes.
Yeah, which can't be selfish.
It's not possible.
Which just replicate, that's all they do. Yeah.
That's all they do.
Yeah.
But that metaphor, once let out into the public,
Mm-hmm.
Had an impact, and it had an impact on politicians, as you mentioned, and on the culture at large. Why do you think that happened, or what lesson can we learn from that era? I think we're passing through it now.
Yeah, it's just sort of ironic that Dawkins is a student of Tinbergen. And yeah, Tinbergen, who got a Nobel Prize, ethologist, he had explained that we should never confuse the evolutionary level of explanation and the psychological, motivational level of explanation. And, yes, and by calling genes selfish, it's exactly what he's doing. So he's exactly making the error that Tinbergen warned against. Now, Dawkins himself, I think he's smart enough to know what he was doing there. He was, and he sometimes warned against his own metaphor, but not effectively enough, because the metaphor took off and everyone was sort of adopting it. And so now we ended up with people thinking that really genes are selfish and that as a result we are selfish. There's many business people who believe that nowadays, is that we're born to be selfish.
Yes.
And I think we're born to be social beings. We're born as group animals like many other primates. So we are born to integrate and support and be supported, and we're very dependent on others, and others are very dependent on us. And so that whole picture was missing in the Dawkins story, and was missing in a lot of biology of the 70s and 80s. The slogan of that time was "Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed." That was the popular slogan, yeah, in all that literature, yeah, is that if you meet a real kind person, you better mistrust, because that cannot be true. It's not, yeah, possible to be a kind person.
Yeah, no, exactly. But what about this issue of level of analysis? Do you think part of it is that when you think only in terms of these very small units, you can miss something that happens at the level of the whole organism, mm-hmm, or of the social organism?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the levels of selection debate
Yes.
is a very complex one, and
Yes.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to say much about that, because even the insect people who are working on colonies that are basically genetically unified, they're not all on board with, let's say, group selection and issues like that. But I do believe that we have been selected to be group living animals, that's for sure, in whichever way. We are predestined to be social, and that's also why, for example, solitary confinement is one of the worst punishments we have. It's almost worse than death.
Yes.
And that is because we are highly social beings. So that's very obvious to me, is that we are not sort of loners.
Yes. And yet, one of the things I think when people watch a talk like yours and you're moved by it, and then you look around and it looks as though our human societies are becoming more fractionated, or more, there's more aloneness and more disconnection. Maybe that's I don't know if that's actually statistically true, but you feel it when you compare it to the world of smaller communities and of agricultural societies, and as we get more organized, the idea that people can go through their day after day after day with almost no connection with another human being.
Our societies are largely anonymous. That's a problem. We have such large numbers that we cannot keep track of everybody. And so the small-scale societies of humans are highly integrated, just like the let's say a baboon troop or a chimp troop. But if you get to the societies that we have nowadays with millions of people, we do some extra networking now with the internet, and I know that some people frown on the Facebook things and stuff like that, but I think it's a form of sociality.
Yes.
The only reason that it's so successful is because we're highly social beings, and we like to have that sort of connection going.
Yeah,
so I don't look at it as a bad thing necessarily.
No, I mean, many people are connecting that way. I've got an 11-year-old, so I see he'll have his friend over, and they will sit in the same room and text each other.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, but they do that.
Actually, do that. If you were to sort of look at your work just kind of broadly, and say that there's one implication that really jumps out at you that you think, if you did have a chance to sort of speak, which as you do, speak to the culture at large, what would be the single message from your research that you think is most commonly missed, just as part of the cultural conversation about?
Well, we tend to use biology for the bad side of human nature. It's like when humans kill each other, we say they're acting like animals. So we like to, everything that is bad about human nature, we blame on our biology.
Right.
And everything that's good, we try to take credit for. Like we humans, we came up with humane behavior or altruism or religion or whatever we think is fancy about us. And that part I don't agree with at all. I think we got both sides from our biology. And so yes, the nasty side we have an aggressive side that we can see in some animals reflected, and we have a very friendly and empathic and cooperative side that also comes from our biology. And so that's, I think, my main message is that both sides, and we should not just put, when we talk about biology, put emphasis on the negative and the competitive.
Yeah, and so those stories that say that by our nature we're actually missing part of our nature when we speak that way. One of the things that you said in your talk is that if you see the same phenomenon in different species, different organisms, etc., and there's no particular reason to have you don't see differences in terms of history, circumstance. There's no reason to use a different principle to explain this over here, and there's a different one for this over there, and you're pointing to that in what you're just talking about, which I really agreed with, and I think it's a very important point.
It comes from David Hume, actually. It's David Hume's touchstone. He said if man and beast act similarly, we have to come up with a shared principle to explain it. And so this is Hume before Darwin, like more than a century before Darwin, who said that. And I say that usually because we get so often accused of anthropomorphism. If I, for example, At some point I discovered that chimpanzees reconcile after fights, and I called it reconciliation, and people said you should not use that terminology. You should call it post-conflict contact. And I said, well, then I'm losing sort of the connection with human behavior, and I'm losing the functionality of it, if I call it that. And so I'd rather call it reconciliation. We now have plenty of evidence that it actually functions as a reconciliation, and is probably motivated in the same way as in humans. But people object to these things, and I feel if two related species act similarly under similar circumstances, you have to come up with the same explanation. So for example, if horses and zebras react similarly under similar circumstances, of course we're going to call it the same thing.
Yes.
Now humans and chimpanzees are not so much further apart than horses and zebras, and so for humans and chimps the same thing would apply. Now chimps are one thing. You could say, well, if we go further away, let's say to elephants or dolphins or rats, but they're all mammals, and so I feel that for all the mammals we have to have some sort of shared terminology.
Yeah. There are some features, of course, there's features of human behavior that do seem distinctive, but just on this issue, one of the things that seems odd in a way is on the one hand how cooperative we can be, and on the other hand how cruel we can be.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if it's really fully distinctive, but it does seem as though that distance is, would you agree, is that it's unusual in the animal kingdom to have it that much.
Yeah, I feel that if we are nasty, we are nastier than any animal I know.
Yes.
We have genocide, which well, ants do something similar maybe, but that's very distant from us. And when we're friendly, we can be more altruistic than anyone we know. So I think we have that whole spectrum, but a little bit, it stretches it maybe a little bit further than what we see in most species. But the same applies to, let's say, chimpanzees. Chimpanzees can be very cooperative, very empathic and friendly with each other and love each other and so on, but they also kill each other.
Yeah.
Now the killing is usually done between groups. It's not so often within the group.
Right.
So it's between, but that's the same is true for humans. So what happens with me, when for example, when I talk about empathy and chimpanzees, people who are skeptical about empathy, they say, well, why do you speak of empathy in chimps? Because they kill each other. And I always reply, well, humans, would you deny empathy to humans? No one would deny it to humans, but we kill each other. And on a bigger scale, I would say, than the chimps do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that difference, do you see it more as quantitative than qualitative?
Yeah, more like a gradual difference. We go to more extremes, I think, also because we are better at perspective taking than these other species. So to be cruel, I know that empathy has this flavor of always being positive, but empathy is the capacity to understand the states of others. And to be cruel, you need empathy also. You need to understand what is harmful to somebody else.
Oh, yeah.
So empathy is actually a neutral mechanism that most of the time I think is used for positive purposes, but can also be used. So a torturer needs empathy also in order to understand what the effect is of the torture.
Yeah, and perspective taking.
Yeah.
But not necessarily kindness or compassion.
No. The compassion and sympathy, they're almost always positive.
Yeah.
So sympathy we usually define as not only understanding the situation of somebody else, but actually wanting to improve that situation if it's a bad situation. That's sympathy. And if you define it that way, then it's by definition positive.
Yeah. One of the things that people who do kind of practical work, and many of the people here at this conference, of course, are clinicians or working with families or groups and so forth, is they want to weigh in to help when there are conflicted families or people dealing with the results of trauma or things of that kind. If you turn to that and look at the arc of your work, are there things that you think sometimes we could draw from non-human animals that we would actually be wise to apply to these kinds of conflict situations?
Yeah, since I'm more sort of preoccupied with the mechanism and how things work and which animals show it and so on, I'm usually not very much involved in how to improve relationships in humans. But we did one time an experiment which was sort of interesting. This was on two macaque species. Macaques are monkeys, and we have two species. One is very conciliatory and friendly and tolerant, as just in their society, and the other one is extremely despotic and hierarchy-based. The dominants punish the subordinates. And we housed the juveniles of the two species together for 6 months. So now we got, and the juveniles of the friendly species were a little bit older, so they were dominant over the other ones. So now we have rhesus monkeys, the ones who are the nasty type, who have been exposed for 6 months to a very different way of doing things by dominant other monkeys. And they became very peace-loving. They became very conciliatory. They became just as conciliatory as the other guys. After fights, they would make up much more easily, 3 times more easily than normal. So that means that social influence, in this case, social environment, makes an enormous effect. Yeah. And that would be my message, is we often think, if I say, for example, reconciliation is something that all the primates show, we think it's an instinctive thing, and that's the end of the story. But then even instinctive behaviors are subject to all sorts of influences from the outside. Yeah. And this is even true for these monkeys, and so it's definitely true for humans, I would say.
Well, in some of these things we know some of the mechanisms, whether it's oxytocin or methylation, particular genes and so forth, where this kind of rearing experience, for example, will actually change the organism in a very biologically sensible way, in addition to the behavioral ways. So it's not just learning, I mean, it's a whole organism being changed in many ways.
I would prefer changes induced by learning over people who say we need to spray oxytocin into rooms, because people say these things, and oxytocin we know has very contradictory effects. Yes. So for example, oxytocin may enhance the in-group feelings, but may also enhance the out-group hostility. Is that what we want to promote? I'm not sure we want to promote that. And so I'd rather have people learn things from experience, so that we, with education, we can maybe change their behavior, than starting to mess with basic mechanisms like that.
Yeah, there is this thing of sometimes when you point to a basic mechanism, and we were talking about it with just the metaphor of a selfish gene, things get away from you. You don't need to. Dawkins didn't mean to, I think, have that effect that he was having on the Thatchers of the world.
No, I think he sometimes regretted it.
Yeah, I would think he would. But then, and so some of that might be cured by better information. There's an example in your own work with the alpha male business, which is just now in common parlance. But what it's come to mean. Yeah, so I looked recently,
because the word alpha male was used so much during the Trump campaign.
Yes.
I looked up on Amazon what it meant. And there are all these business books, how to be an alpha male. And if you then read the summaries of these business books, I should read some of them, but if you read the summaries, it's how to beat up your opponents, basically. Exactly. How to drill into them that you are the boss and they are not the boss. Yes. And how to get even with people, so a vindictive type of thing. And that's really, for me, that's maybe part of being alpha male. You do need to intimidate your opponents. That's maybe part of it. But the alpha males that I know in chimpanzee society, for example, they also make peace, they keep order, they console victims of aggression, and they can be extremely popular as a result. Yeah. They don't necessarily eat all the food, they share the food with others. And so for me, an alpha male is more like a leader type. Yeah.
I wonder if that might be one of those things that do distinguish us, just in the sense that once symbolically we start categorizing things that way. I mean, you just say alpha male to somebody, and that what your data actually show of this mix of, learning how to command authority and so forth, but on the other hand, showing acts of kindness, I don't know what else, what the word you could use, of sharing and caring.
We had in the Arnhem colony of the chimps, the first group that I worked with, we had an alpha female who was so powerful. She was, in terms of official rank, she was the 5th ranking chimp, because the males ranked above her. But she was sort of the center of the group. And she had this mixture, interesting mixture. She would enforce her position. No female would dare to mess with her, because she would get even and she would really let them know who's boss. But she was always there for everybody who needed her. Even the males, in the middle of their conflicts, they would sometimes end up with her, because she would sit between them and keep them sort of from fighting with each other. And she would sometimes bring them together to reconcile. She would get one male and bring him to the other male and to have them to reconcile. So she was extremely influential, very central in the group, but not in the sense that you could walk over her. That was not a possibility.
Yeah.
And I think in humans we have that kind of behavior also all the time.
You know, you're one of those basic scientists who has become notable in applied science, in clinical science. Clinicians invite you to come and speak. We're not just a clinical group here at ACBS, but still very dominantly. And you can see by this the reception and so forth, how moved people were. I wonder part of that is that clinicians do have to deal with these kind of dialectics. You know, it isn't just the simple one way, it's both. And they find something, I'd be interested in your thoughts as to why, but what I do see, people are kind of lifted up or you know, buoyed up by basic data that comports with the importance of these kind of processes that you see in human lives, who are often struggling with mental health and behavioral health problems inside a history that's been traumatic and difficult and not nurturant and so forth. And here are these very basic biological kind of needs for connection and belonging and caring, and that sometimes people just don't have. And what do you think? Do you know? Do you have any thoughts?
I think clinicians.
It's like, why am I?
I think clinicians deal every day with non-verbal expressions of behavior, or verbal expression for that matter, but with the nitty-gritty of behavior. And if you open the books of psychologists or clinical psychologists, you get a lot of theory and big thoughts about where things come from and so on. And so the ethologist, like myself, as someone who studies animal behavior, we think in terms of expressions of behavior, like they groom each other, or they have sex together, or they beat each other over the head, and we describe these things. And the videos that I show in my talks show the nonverbal behavior. And I think the clinicians recognize all that behavior, but maybe in their literature there's not enough attention to it, in the sense that that's sort of missing. In the sense that the literature that they read is sort of removed, one step removed from all that nonverbal behavior that I emphasize, because that's the only thing I can work with. And so I think that's a bit of the connection that's also playing. And you saw how often people laughed about the animals, even at moments that they do things which, for example, I show a little video of yawn contagion, how chimpanzees, when they see yawning chimps on video, they start to yawn. Why do people laugh about that? I think they laugh because they recognize it. It's a bit of a shock, like, oh, the chimp is doing exactly what I'm doing. So it's a bit of a shock also, like they had not expected maybe that they were so similar to a chimp. But it's also the recognition that there's a connection. And we sometimes laugh about children that way. When children reenact something that seems very adult to us, we start laughing, you know.
In a different direction, we were chatting at one point here, and I mentioned this group, you know, has a connection to the contextual wing of behavioral psychology, going back to a particular take on Skinnerian psychology. And ethologists and Skinnerians have often been a bit at odds. I think in part, I'm just guessing, would it be okay to explore why, in your own thoughts, because you mentioned I'm not a big fan of Skinner, that, you know, putting animals in barren environments, you know, and trying to, the late Gilbert Gottlieb was a chair of my department, and I explored this with him many times. I have to say, not completely successfully. But is that part of the concern that you would have about that wing? The
tension is partly because in the previous century, everything about animals, not so much humans necessarily, but everything about animals had to fit in one of two boxes. Everything either was instinct, or it was simple learning, like what Skinner, you know, the conditioning type, associative type learning. And as soon as you mentioned that something didn't fit in those two boxes, you said maybe animals are thinking, or they have intentions, or they have plans, or they have emotions. Both the ethologists and the Skinnerians, they didn't know what to do with that. It didn't fit. And the tension between the ethologists and the Skinnerians is, of course, because we were with one box, like the instinct box, the biological box, and they were with the learning, the simple learning box. Right. But now we have a whole new generation of people who work on cognition in animals, and you can see it every week now on the internet. Their discoveries come out every week of things that don't really fit so clearly in those two boxes.
Yeah.
Things that relate to planning or episodic memory or metacognition and so on. We have all these things that are coming out now that are much more complex than what we assumed.
And yet in the applied environment, some of these principles that came from animal learning, from that tradition, still to this day, if you're going to say what is the list of evidence-based therapies and so forth,
well,
probably half the list.
I don't have any problem with behaviorism in the sense of that they were wrong. I think there's nothing wrong with the conditioning paradigm in the sense that every dog trainer or horse trainer makes use of it every day, and it works. We know it works. So I have no trouble with the idea that it's an important part of human or animal behavior. It's just that the Scanarians, they wanted to reduce everything to that kind of principle, and that's really not possible.
Well, I think actually they would, even Skinner regularly would say, no. I mean, so all these things are important. But there's this classic thing, there's a book now out of his conversation with Ed Wilson. I don't know if you've seen the book.
No, I've never seen that.
It's a fascinating one because they actually recorded, and Fred asked for the interview, and it was recorded, his opening lines or something. It was, why are you trying to hold us out? He's basically saying we should be, it was right after sociobiology had come out, why aren't we part of it? Which is a little bit rude, but it's affiliative in a way where, we should be part of your group. But then when they were having a conversation, every single thing that Ed brought up, he could say, well, it could also be an operant because, and my
well, that's something that bothers us biologists, that everything needs to go back to that principle.
Yeah. And my colleague, David Sloan Wilson, we worked together regularly, had said if he just wouldn't have said that, the conversation would have gone better. It actually was relatively pleasant. But you can understand it just in this way. We have a place at the table too. But it gets heard as the only thing that matters is what I'm doing, and maybe that's just.
Well, if the behaviorists, for example, there's still some behaviors left also in animal behavior. Yeah. If these people would say, well, our principles would fit with your principles, and we can sort of share them, so to speak, there would be much less hostility. Yeah. It is because as soon as, let's say, someone says chimpanzees plan ahead, then we have quite a bit of evidence now that they can plan ahead. They can take tools that they use only 3 hours later and things like that. Sure. So if they then immediately try to reduce that to associative learning, then we get upset because we say, why would you want to do that? And it's maybe possible. Then we do some control tests and we rule it out, for example. And they still keep insisting, and that creates a lot of hostility, I think. Is that sort of stubbornness about it.
Finding a way to cooperate and work together and see some value in all these different traditions and how to put them together. That is something that I have to say, this group I think is doing a pretty good job of keeping both basic and clinician together in a group. I'd be interested in your responses just to the people you've talked to and so forth, if you felt that this wing of behavioral thinking feels open or closed, or they?
No, it feels rather open, and it feels evidence-based, which of course for every scientist likes that. Is that we go with the data basically, and I don't know if you do the same thing for your therapies. Is that also you have a sort of evaluation at the end and statistics and so on?
Very much so.
Okay.
I mean, the dominant view in this, well, not view, but there's multiple treatment traditions in here, but the dominant one is acceptance and commitment therapy, which has about 1,000 studies on it, and about 200 randomized trials and so forth. And everybody's, very cautious about making claims until you have adequate data and so forth. So the empirically based therapy is really important to us. That we find a way to bring the clinical traditions more fully into science more generally.
People often ask me if, for example, in chimpanzees we have schizophrenics, or we have autism, or we have whatever pathology they think of. But in chimpanzees, I work with 25 chimps, and I'm very lucky to have so many chimps to work with. But what are my chances if there are schizophrenic chimps to hit one? And that's just, the chances are so low because the numbers are so low. And we do have a spectrum. I did once with Scott Lilienfeld, who's an expert on psychopathology.
Sure.
We did some sort of personality assessment of the chimps, which we did through humans. So the caretakers would fill out the lists of personality, and we did find the dimension of psychopathology in them. We did not necessarily have psychopathic chimps, but the dimension came out of that study. So I think that's all possible, but it's very hard with the small numbers that we work with to find that kind of things.
One thing you said somewhere in your writing is that these clear differences between humans and non-human animals over and over again. Here's the dividing line, here's the dividing line, here's the dividing line, and then I think the metaphor you used, it's like water washing over the sand, and eventually it turns into hills and not cliffs. And yet we're sitting here in a building with artificial lights and cameras, and just within the last 50 years many of these things wouldn't be here, and this incredible rate of development in terms of science and technology. And so on the one hand you have that fact, I think it is a fact, that over and over again these differences have been shown to be on a continuum, and almost always smaller than originally supposed. And on the other hand you have this spectacularly different thing, which the bird outside the window is doing more or less what it was doing 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Some changes and so forth, but we're not. Is it naive to think that there is some very small difference? It has to be small, probably.
Well, most of the technology
difference
now that we on airplanes and we have iPhones, most of the technology is a product of science, and a cumulative product of science, in the sense that I can read a science book from 500 years ago and still get interesting information out of that. There's no way that a chimpanzee can get information from 500 years ago. So we have this cumulative thing going, and the technological developments that you're talking about are all over the last 2,000 years or so, or 3,000 years maybe. And I know people sometimes point at, let's say, their iPhone and they say, reinvented the iPhone. But the iPhone is an invention that includes 2,000 years of science. Sure. And there's not a single person who can claim that he invented the iPhone. The iPhone has an enormous amount of knowledge built into it. Yeah. So yes, we have this cumulative capacity, which is a cultural capacity, I think, more than a biological one, even though, of course, our brains are sort of designed for this. So we can accumulate knowledge, and that's how we got now to the point that every 2 years we have a new iPhone coming out with more capacities. And so the technology is really running very fast now. I'm not sure that makes us fundamentally different, but the cultural capacity to write down knowledge, to linguistically transfer knowledge, and to accumulate it that way, that's a typical human thing.
Although, like the cross-fostered chimpanzees, for example, I mean, Alan and Trixie Gardner were in my department, knew them well. Yeah. And there are certain kind of basic processes. Kind of, when I put one in front of you, it's probably not fair to do, but it's something that's important to this group because of this theory of language and cognition that has been studied a lot here, called relational frame theory. So 12-month-old babies, if they learn conditional discrimination, say from A to B and matching to sample, will at a certain point, given B, will pick A. It's not yet been shown in non-human animals. There's about 30 years of trying, because this is out of the
This is reversal learning, or what is it?
Well, yeah, it's similar to reversal learning, but being able to derive symmetry and combinatorial and symmetrical relations, which we know with young children, if you aren't able to reverse the discrimination by around 12, 13 months, you're headed towards serious language deficiencies. If it doesn't change, you will never develop a normal language. Yeah. When it was tested there in Atlanta, the chimps couldn't do it. So I wonder, here's what I'm saying. This is one of these things that's decided. Would it disturb you if you found that there was a place that had a cliff just in this way? Some very small difference in terms of a learning process or something of that kind that culture could then attach to. That could have a huge outcome given enough time culturally to develop it.
Yeah, I do consider our linguistic capacities uniquely human. That's the only one that I recognize.
Yeah, that's the only one I recognize too.
And even then, if you take the language capacity as a whole and you break it into pieces, like classification of things, organization of things, symbolic communication, syntax, and you can take all these things. For every one of them, for some more than others, you can probably find animal parallels.
Yeah.
But the whole thing, like a flexible symbolic communication system, the whole thing together, I don't think we find in animals, and I've never seen strong evidence for that.
Yeah.
Even though people who work on, let's say, primate vocalizations, they are very eager to make these connections with human language. And I think many connections exist, but I still feel the human language capacity is special.
Yeah.
So no, I would not have a trouble if you say, well, we have certain capacities that animals don't have. We also have a brain that is 3 times bigger than a chimp brain. And a brain is a very costly...
But the elephants. The elephants have us trumped, don't we?
Yeah, the elephants are interesting because not long ago, like 5-6 years ago, someone said we should not go with brain size. We should just count the neurons. And we just count the neurons, and that will tell us how intelligent the species is. And humans came out on top. We had the most neurons. Then it was discovered that the elephants actually have 3 times more neurons. Now, it turns out that 97% of these neurons sit in the cerebellum.
Right.
So now they say we should maybe not count the cerebellum, but I'm not sure about that.
It's moving the goalposts a little bit.
We keep moving.
Well, that's back to that thing. If you look for the cliff and then you find the soft hill, and I think some of that.
I think humans have a 3 times bigger brain than a chimpanzee, and we know that brains are very expensive instruments. So yes, there must be something to it. We would not have that if we didn't need it, I would think.
Yeah. Well, could I just thank you for spending
You're
time
welcome.
with me, and especially for coming and speaking with us. It is a fascinating talk, and your work is important to people around the world.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Frans.
Thanks.